It's 1865, which makes this about the 152nd year of the celebration here at the Stone. In the recent memory, thank you. In recent memory, the people are asked to join us from the different organizations and the different communities in Montreal, because the Irish who came here in 1847, who perished under the very ground that we're standing on, which is where they're buried, made such a contribution to Montreal, to Quebec, and then to Canada as we moved east and west from this very point. So it's so important that we remember the contribution and the suffering that took place at this site. So I'd like to introduce you to somebody who's known to most people in Point St. Charles. He's involved in many, many things here, the Point Theatre being one, and someone who does a lot of hard work for the Montreal Irish Monument Park Foundation. Now, the Park Foundation was created 4 years ago to make sure that where we're standing is no longer a desolate place where we need police protection in order to not be run over by a car. We intend to have the stone moved across the street into the parking lot, replace the stone with the Celtic cross, and give the people the chance to do what my two grandchildren are doing, which is run around the stone. Because buried beneath us are complete families whose children never got the opportunity to run around this ground. So let's give their ancestors the opportunity to do that. So I'd like to introduce you to Fergus Keys, and he'll bring us up to date on where we stand.
Ooh, I gotta yell. I guess I gotta yell. Okay, as Victor mentioned, my name's Fergus Keys, and I am one of the directors of the Montreal Irish Monument Park Foundation. The objective of our foundation is to convince various levels of government, particularly the City of Montreal and the federal government, to allow us to build a very nice cultural green space in that parking lot that you see behind you, and all the way down to that end. But to speak about building a park, we have to explain a little bit about the history and how this came about. Now, I know many of you already understand what went on, but for those of you that don't, just give me a couple of minutes to give you the highlights, because the story is very, very big, and I keep you here all afternoon. But let's say on the highlights of the story, 1847 was the middle of what many of us know as the Irish famine, which they now call the Great Hunger. It was the middle of about a 5-year stretch when the Irish faced the potato famine and were dying. During that 5-year period, 1 million Irish died in Ireland. 1 million Irish left the country. Of the million that left the country, 100,000 left for what was then British North America, the colonies of British North America. This is 1847, 20 years before Confederation. So they're heading to the Maritime provinces, to Lower Canada, Quebec, what we would call it, Upper Canada, Ontario, what we would call it today. So 100,000 leave. They've already been scrounging for food for 2 years. They're sick, they're tired, they're hungry. When they get onto the boats that were really boats made to transport lumber from Canada to Ireland. They were never made to transport people, but they were used to transport people, and the people basically became the ballast on the boats. So they were overcrowded. These Irish, of course, had nothing when they got on the boats, except for one thing. What they did have, what we would call, what the Rock called ship's fever, and what we would call today typhus. Typhus is very contagious. It has a very weird incubation period. So they get on the boats with this typhus, 100,000 heading toward Lower Canada, and they start to die. And as they die, they get thrown into the cold Atlantic Ocean. They die coming up the St. Lawrence River in the Maritimes. They die at Grosse Ile, which was the station where they would be stopped to be checked, but because the doctors were well overworked and didn't really understand how typhus worked, they waived on a number of them. But the ones that ended up on Grosse Ile, there was 5,000 at least that died there. Most of the numbers I give you are guesstimates, mainly because nobody kept the records. These names are not known of these victims. but we know that more than 5,000 died and were buried on Grosse Hill. They continued on in through the rest of Canada. As a point of interest, they died in Lachine, they died in Cornwall, they died in Kingston, they died in Toronto, at least 1,000 more died in Toronto. But of course we're talking about here in Montreal. So in the spring of 1847, the Irish start showing up on the port just over here, the port of Montreal, and a few of them start dying right there. So along comes a gentleman by the name of John Mills. John Mills was the mayor of Montreal in 1847. He understood that it was very important to get these sick Irish away from the population. By this time, after the ones that have died on Grosse Hill and died coming across, there's about 90,000 left that have now hit the port of Montreal. You also got to understand the island of Montreal in 1847 had about 50,000 people. So you have 50,000 people and 90,000 Irish, so twice the number of the population. So John Mills knew he had to do something. And what he did is that he ordered some sheds built to try and put the sick Irish, keep them away from the population. And those sheds were built right where you're all standing. As best we can tell, they were built right here. It started off with one shed, in the end there was 22 or 24 sheds, depending on which historical account you read. So the Irish come here in the summer, the spring and summer and fall of 1847. Some people definitely went to help them. John Mills, the mayor that I just mentioned, after he stopped being mayor during the day, in the evenings he would go and work with the Irish, try and provide nursing care. He caught typhus and he died in November of 1847. He's sometimes called the martyr mayor of Montreal, forgotten to the history, and that's terrible that he is forgotten to the history. Many religious groups went, of course. Some Catholic, the Grey Nuns, most of the victims being Irish and Catholic. The Grey Nuns went, other religious orders went. The Catholic clergy went, the Anglican clergy went. Even British soldiers, because there were Montrealers at the time, as in any big group, that really wanted to take these sheds that were here and the Irish and push them all into the damn St. Lawrence River. So there was a group that thought that this might be the way to solve the problem. John Mills, who was still alive at the time, set up a British picket around the area, a British guard. It was still under British control, of course, so he put up British guards. These British guards, a number of them, some of them were Irish, of course, working for the British, but a number of English guards went in to help after they were finished. They caught typhus and they died. So there was any number of people that went along to help them. One of the other big groups is over the summer of 1847, when it was over, mostly 1847, a little 1848, at least 6,000 Irish died and were buried here, right here, where you're talking. There was 3 or 4 large burial spots. Because the shorelines change, it's a little difficult to exactly pinpoint. We believe there was one just at the Victoria Bridge. There was that one over in the Wellington Basin. There was probably one somewhere about here. These were the big ones. The thing is that they started off with coffins. It got so bad at the end that they were doing what was called trenching. They had no more coffins, so they were digging holes and just throwing the bodies into the space. The number that's often quoted is 6,000. With the stuff that I've been researching, and some of us have been researching over the last years, personally I think it's higher than 6,000. One of the reasons is as they ran out of coffins, they would often take a mother who died and her 2 children, put them in the same coffin and bury it. I think they counted that as 1, when really it was 3. Anyhow, it's up for discussion, but we believe that at least 6,000 died here on this spot in 1847. In 1859, 12 years after the event, the guys building the Victoria Bridge, many of whom were Irish, pulled this rock out of the St. Lawrence River. They wanted to put a monument. They needed to put a monument. And it's our understanding, basically told the contractors on the Victoria Bridge, we put a monument or you don't get a bridge. The Irish can sometimes be a little bit of a pain. Anyhow, they convinced them and they brought out the rock and they stuck it up here. As long as the grass grows and as long as the water flows, this rock is supposed to stay here. There's a whole historical thing about the rock. It's been moved and brought back. Basically, it's almost in exactly the location where it first started off, although it may be out by about 17 to 20 feet. We're not really sure in which direction, but that's what we figure. So that idea, let me tell you just a couple of stories so that you can really get the feeling of it, that you can understand it. There is one guy who was maybe, I don't know, maybe a war reporter. At any rate, in 1847 he traveled all over the world. And he wrote a memoir very late in his life when he was in his 80s or 90s, and he said, I've seen a lot of death and destruction everywhere. Some of it man-made, some of it natural. But never have I seen anything so sad that has stuck in my mind so much as a grey nun carrying a dead Irish child off a boat. So that gives you some kind of a bit of a feeling for it, you know. Also, the Irish were actually in Lower Canada long before the British even showed up in 1759. But a very large group came in 1825, mostly Irish, mostly Catholic again. And many of them ended up in Griffintown. So when these victims came 20 years later, 25 years later in 1847, the Irish of Griffintown opened their doors to them. The Irish being the way that they are, they just opened the doors to their Irish cousins. Of course, what they were doing was bringing in typhus into the house. So any number of citizens, Irish citizens, Montreal citizens, also died in 1847. And one last story, I mean, I could keep you all day with these stories, but one last one that I think you should consider is that, as I mentioned, a French-speaking Quebecois family adopted many of the at least 2,000 orphans from this event. And one of the sad stories, again, is a French-speaking Quebecois widow. Her husband had just died a year or two before. She had 6 children of her own, so she had 6 young children. She brought an Irish child into her home. The child had typhus. She worked with him, she nursed him back to health. Everything was just great, except she got typhus and died. So now instead of her 6 orphans, now there's 7 orphans with the Irish kid. So these were people, you know, they're not statistics, they're not numbers, they're people. So that's mainly why our group wants to do something in memorial of all of it. Not only just the Irish, but also the French-speaking Quebecois that adopted the Irish orphans, also the many Montrealers, guys like John Mills, the mayor that went there, who was not Irish and wasn't Catholic. He just felt he had to do what he had to do. The British soldiers who were obviously not Irish were Catholic. So we want to build a big park that's very inclusive to everybody. So where does it stand now? Well, where it stands is last year we met with the mayor of Montreal, Denis Coderre, and he said to us, I support your project, I'm going to make it happen, and I'm going to champion it. We met with him a couple of days ago, and he said to us, I support your project, I'm going to make it happen, and I will champion it. All that, what it means is I'm not really sure. One difficulty that the mayor and the city of Montreal has, that obviously has, is that this land, all of this land, is actually owned by the federal government. That was only discovered in December of this last year. So the federal government owns all of this property. It's owned under something called Canada Lands Corporation or the Old Ports of Montreal. So our group, including Victor, myself, etc., we have a meeting with Old Ports of Montreal next week, early June, to see how they feel about it. But somehow we've got to get the city of Montreal and the federal government, one or the other, to build this park or work together to build it. But we have to keep the heat up on them. So certainly if any of you have a couple of minutes, you can always fire off an email to Justin Trudeau or to Denis Coderre or to both of them and say, hey, let's get this thing built. You know. The other thing is that we keep on doing events. So there is one more event that's coming up that I'd like to mention to you, since I have you here as a captive audience and you have to listen to me. There's one more event on June the 10th. There's a gentleman by the name of Michael Collins, not the Michael Collins that was the rebel in the Irish. It's a new Michael Collins, who is a Booker Prize winner, and he's also a long-distance runner. So on June 10th, he's leaving Grosse Ile, and he is running from Grosse Ile to Toronto, where they have already built an Irish Monument Park. So he's going to run from Grosse Ile to Toronto. He's going to stop right here on this spot on June 17th, which is a Friday at noon. So I know some of you, of course, have a job and you probably can't make it, but if any of you are available, and we'll keep on putting out the information, it'd be really great if you could join us here on June 17th, Friday at noon, to welcome Michael Collins. He's running for 2 big reasons. One is to remind people of this terrible event, which was probably the biggest loss of life of any event in Canada's history ever, and has been forgotten too much, so he wants to remind people. And the second thing is that he's going to be raising some funds for a number of projects between Grosse Ile and Toronto, including for our project. So that's where we stand right now. We hope to keep on pushing it, and we hope to have all your support and the support of anybody else that you can talk to. Talk to your family, your friends, whatever, and get them all on board. We do have a Facebook page and we do have a web page, so please join it and stay in touch with us. Thank you.